I want to address the whole narrative about El Salvador's like prison system having destroyed crime or whatever, because it's completely false. So, this is the entire justification that is being used for like deporting people to El Salvador, is this narrative that Bukele, the president of El Salvador, destroyed crime and improved the murder rate via mass incarceration. And this is used by him and by his many international admirers to justify the mass imprisonment strategy. This narrative is completely false, because Bukele actually tackled crime in a completely different way, and the prison thing is something that he came up with later to attempt to solidify his hold on power and as a way to basically justify the mass imprisonment of his political opponents and like anyone who he considers undesirable. So what actually happened is completely different. This was revealed in El Faro, which is a Salvadorian newspaper, which I believe has since had to move to Panama because he threatened them with putting them in the prisons. So back in 2020, when they were reporting on this, Bukele started targeting the leadership of this newspaper, El Faro, and a lot of the people who are involved with it had to move abroad to continue reporting. So what happened is back in 2020, this is before the mass incarceration began. The mass incarceration only began in 2022. In 2022, Bukele declared a state of exception, which is still going today, like a complete suspension of constitutional rights, everything, which is still ongoing today. And that is when the mass incarceration began. So this article is from 2020. Bukele has been negotiating with MS-13 for a reduction in homicides and electoral support. So Alfaro obtained dozens of documents confirming dozens of covert meetings between government officials and gang leaders since 2019, as well as intelligence reports detailing the outcomes of the encounters. Representatives of the executive branch and MS-13 agreed to the reduction in homicides in exchange for prison privileges and long-term pledges tied to the results of the elections in 2021. So they have tons of evidence over this. So what actually happened here is very simple. The murder rate in El Salvador was going down very early in Bukele's presidency. If you look at the murder rate, you see this incredibly drastic drop-off immediately upon him being elected. He got elected in 2019. The negotiations with the gangs begin immediately. Murder rate goes down, keeps going down afterwards. So what actually happened here is very simple. Bukele actually did something that was good to begin with. The negotiations with the gangs were good. Because these are not serious criminal organizations. By serious, I don't mean like people think of these gangs, they think of like mafias or cartels or something. That's not what these gangs are. These gangs are unsophisticated street gangs, totally reliant on the leaders, that fall apart once you get to leadership. What he did is he basically negotiated with the leaders and gave them like special privileges and stuff in exchange for them calling off the grunts on the ground from doing the shit they usually did. All they really did was like extortion. I don't mean to downplay it, but like we're talking about like street gangs that go into stores and like say, hey, give me your money or I'll shoot you. Stuff like that. We're not talking about like real transnational criminal enterprises, like serious businesses and stuff like that, like the cartels. This is relatively low-level stuff in the grand scheme of things like that. So these gangs were very easy to deal with. The reason why the cartels are hard to deal with is because you couldn't do this sort of thing to them because they're like businesses. They have basically like boards of executives and shit, in effect. Not exactly, but in effect. So like you kill the leader, you arrest the leader, it doesn't matter. The cartel's still going to be there. Others will take over. The network of businesses, of distribution, of all that stuff is still there. The gangs in El Salvador aren't like that. Not at all. You get to the leaders and everyone else has no fucking idea what to do. You also can't go after the cartels like you do here. There's this mythology of them being good at fighting. That's not why the Mexican state doesn't go after them. The Mexican state doesn't go after them for one, because they're bribed. But for two, because they actually are pseudo-governments. You can't go after them without also functionally like killing thousands of other people and like destroying the entire reason why they can be as big as they are, which is because they are so like embedded in the local population because they basically run the fucking places where their strongholds are. This is not the case with these gangs. These gangs are just like basically petty thugs with like a leadership based on like brutality and respect. It's basically like a prison gang, except a lot of people are on the outside. So it was a lot easier to negotiate with the leaders and to fuck them over. And the reason why the El Salvadorian gangs can exist as they do, by the way, is because no one cares about El Salvador. The cartels, if anything, can use them to distribute drugs and to help them. And they don't really care as much about having their own operations there. But the point is, Bukele did something good at the beginning of his term, which was negotiate. Then, after the murder rate had already drastically fallen, what he did to make it fall more was they stopped reporting accurately murders. not the mass imprisonment. Because as you can see, it was already falling so fucking much, like more than halved before the state of exception began in 2022. What happened after that is quite simply, they stopped accurately reporting the murders to try and justify the mass imprisonment. Because the whole thing here is, honestly, if you're a dictator, you should learn from this. It was a good idea. The initial fall in homicide rates came from the negotiation. That's all. That was the initial reason for it. That's simple. You know, they tried to reason with them and it worked. Then what happened after that is Bukele saw an opportunity to be like, okay, I could imprison fucking anyone I want here. I could basically perpetuate myself in power forever if I put a bunch of people into prison and I start saying that the homicide rate, which was already falling beforehand, is falling because of that. I would be so popular and like anyone criticizes me, they get put into prison. And that's precisely what he did. He institutes the state of exception that allows him to do whatever he wants to whoever he wants. And they start underreporting murders just to like try and make it look like the fall is more dramatic than the previous falls. Which, to be clear, it's not. As a percentage, it's about the same. Like this article here goes over how as soon as they began the 2020 crackdown, they started undercounting homicides. In 2019, Bukele ascended to the presidency. Almost immediately, he began a 3-year period of secret gang negotiations and diplomacy, which saw the homicide rate fall to just 18 people per 100,000 in 2021. Then Bukele launched the dramatic crackdown, which suspended several basic constitutional rights and was followed by aggressive criminal reforms. It is now permanent, the state of exception, and now according to Bukele's administration, the homicide rate has fallen. However, under Bukele's crackdown, the government has been undercounting homicides by as much as 47%. This is no bureaucratic or clerical error. Since taking office, Bukele's administration has been laser focused on reducing homicide rates and improving perceptions of security. They have also increased the practice of burying the bodies of victims of murder in unmarked, often mass graves, in effect reducing the number of publicly visible killings. Oh yeah, this is something that I forgot to mention. Bukele was actually indicted in the USA, or at least people in his administration were indicted in US courts for their negotiations with gang leaders in El Salvador. And apparently the prosecutor mentioned this. I didn't know that he mentioned this. According to a 2022 US federal indictment, MS-13 leaders were continued to authorize murders where the victims' bodies were allowed to authorize murder where the victims' bodies were buried or otherwise hidden. So the official murder counting agency began excluding the discovery of unmarked graves from its counts. So basically, if you're buried in an unmarked grave, you're not murdered, apparently. I wouldn't set aside the possibility that the government themselves is burying bodies in unmarked graves to hide the homicides, because otherwise, the numbers wouldn't add up. They also stopped including prison murders in the count as well. There's a lot of stuff. As you can see with the numbers here, they started excluding a much larger proportion of homicides compared to previously. The reduction in homicides in El Salvador is almost entirely a result of the initial negotiations with the gangs. The prison thing is something that came much later, basically as a justification for him to get a bigger grasp on power. And now they're literally exporting El Salvador. Like they're exporting El Salvador as like, they're selling it as like this international prison dictatorship that anyone can send their prisoners to for whatever reason they want, no matter what. Which is, it's insane, by the way. That people deported to El Salvador, they have not been charged in the US, and they aren't charging El Salvador either. And the reason why this can happen is because in El Salvador, you can literally be imprisoned indefinitely for any reason. It doesn't matter. Any reason whatsoever. You're totally at the mercy of the government. So don't go to El Salvador. They're trying to increase tourism to El Salvador on this narrative that it's safe now. You do not go to El Salvador ever. They can literally arrest you for any reason they please, and you will never be seen again. Like, the government justifies this by saying, like, it's justified that we imprison random people because the murder rate has gone down. And yes, undoubtedly, some of the people who we imprison are innocent, but this is inevitable. This always happens. It's worth it. The ends justify the means. But the thing is, the means were negotiations and diplomacy with the gangs, which, to be clear, I think was a good idea. If ever the cartel problem is going to be dealt with in Mexico, for example, you have to negotiate with the cartels. You have to do something. You have to talk to them directly. It's the only way. So that was a good thing that he did. It wasn't a bad idea at all. And it got good results almost immediately. But the problem is that he used the murder rate falling after the one good thing that he did to justify basically taking power and turning his country into a prison dictatorship where anyone he doesn't like or anyone any cop doesn't like can just be sent to prison arbitrarily, and they'll never be seen again. You'll never know what they're in for. They have no charges, no nothing. And there's no judicial system in El Salvador anymore, if there ever was before. It is literally a place where anyone can be arrested at any time, put into a prison, and whether they are alive or anything, no one knows. The only proof of life that you get if you are a family member is that maybe one day they're randomly released. So I just wanted to talk about the narrative that like he lowered the homicide rate, because he did lower the homicide rate, but it's nothing to do with the mass imprisonment. Nothing to do with it at all. The mass imprisonment was basically like an opportunistic measure instituted for the sake of him being able to hold on to power via getting rid of any people who he considers like unsightly, basically, or anyone who opposes him, or basically anyone he just slightly doesn't like. Because now they can be imprisoned for any reason for as long as he wants. So yeah, I just wanted to cover that.